On Monday, December 11th, 1989, at 5:40 in the afternoon, a coroner recorded the death of a man in a rented apartment in the Las Virgenes area of Calabasas, California. The apartment was small and quiet, not a mansion, not a suite at the Beverly Wilshire, not the kind of place anyone would associate with one of the most famous surnames in American entertainment. A rifle lay near the body. The December light outside had already begun to fade. The man was 51 years old. His name was Lindsay Crosby, and he was the youngest son of the voice that had sung America to sleep every Christmas for half a century. According to family representatives, what had broken him was simple. The inheritance money he had counted on to keep his life together was gone. The trust had collapsed. The safety net had been pulled away. And in a quiet room in the suburban hills above Los Angeles, the son of the man who made White Christmas feel like home had decided he could not continue. His father had been dead for 12 years. His mother had been dead for 37. His eldest brother had already torn the family open in print, describing a childhood of ritualized beatings and emotional coldness behind the most beloved public image in American entertainment. And Lindsay was not the last. This is the story of Bing Crosby's 7 children, 4 from a first marriage that ended in alcoholism, abuse allegations, and 2 suicides, and 3 from a second marriage that looked by every account like a different family entirely. 2 households, 2 versions of the same father, and a question that the Crosby name has never been able to answer. The name Crosby, for most of the 20th century, meant something very specific in American life. It meant ease. It meant warmth. It meant a particular kind of comfort that arrived through radios and theater speakers and eventually television sets in living rooms across the country, the sound of a man who seemed incapable of strain. Bing Crosby was not simply famous, he was foundational. In the 1940s, public opinion polls placed him ahead of sitting presidents and the Pope as one of the most admired men alive. He won an Academy Award for Going My Way. He recorded White Christmas, which remains, more than 8 decades later, the best-selling single in the history of recorded music. He was the voice America trusted to make the holidays feel like home. And home for the 4 sons of his first marriage appears to have been the womb. To understand what happened to Lindsay Crosby and to the 3 brothers who preceded him into the ground, you have to go back before the memoirs and the lawsuits and the suicides, to the construction of the first Crosby household and the 2 people who built it. Harry Lillis Crosby was born in Tacoma, Washington in 1903 and raised in Spokane, the 4th of 7 children in a Catholic household that was comfortable but not wealthy. There was no family fortune. There was no entertainment pedigree. What Bing had was voice and an instinct for the emerging mass technologies of the century: sound recording, radio, motion pictures, and he rode them with a shrewdness that his easygoing public manner tended to obscure. By the late 1920s, he had moved from regional vaudeville into the recording studio and onto the radio. By the mid-30s, he was the highest-paid entertainer in the country. By the early 40s, he was arguably the most recognized voice on earth. The money that followed was enormous, and it was new. This was not old East Coast aristocracy or inherited industrial wealth. The Crosby fortune was built on recording royalties, film salaries, radio sponsorships, real estate, and a business apparatus sophisticated enough that it would survive its creator by decades, generating litigation between the first and second families well into the 21st century. Bing's estate was not a trust fund passed down through generations. It was a machine he built, and the question of who would benefit from that machine and who would be destroyed by the expectations attached to it, and is one of the engines of this story. What mattered about Bing's public persona was not just its scale, but its texture. He projected something that felt effortless, a relaxed baritone, a wry humor, a studied informality that audiences read as authenticity. He seemed like the kind of man who would be easy to live with, the kind of father who would ruffle his son's hair and let them stay up late. That was the image. That was the product. And the distance between that product and the reality inside his first home is where this entire story lives. Dixie Lee complicates the origin in a way that matters. Born Wilma Winifred Wyatt in Harriman, Tennessee, though even her birth year carries the fingerprints of old Hollywood fabrication, with most biographical record placing it in 1909, while studio publicity sometimes shaved years for effect. She was a singer and actress who had her own career trajectory before Bing Crosby entered her life. At the moment of their marriage on September 29th, 1930, she was the more established name. She had screen credits, she had a public following. She was young, ambitious, and talented in her own right. The marriage was supposed to be a union of two rising stars. It became something else entirely. The trouble started almost immediately. Bing and Dixie separated in 1931, barely a year into the marriage. The reasons, as reconstructed by biographers and family accounts, were tangled: Bing's drinking, the pressures of sudden fame, temperamental incompatibility, and the early signs of the pattern that would define the household for 2 decades. When they reconciled, the terms had already shifted. Bing's career was detonating upward: radio contracts, film roles, a recording schedule that would eventually produce more than 1,600 commercial recordings, and Dixie was beginning the long retreat from public life that would come to define her. She stopped performing, she withdrew into domesticity, and she began drinking in a way that would eventually consume her. Biographers and later family summaries agree on this much. Alcoholism became one of the central destabilizing forces inside the Crosby home, and Dixie was deep inside it. She was not the only one. Bing himself had a reputation for heavy drinking in his younger years, though by most accounts he pulled back as his career grew more demanding. What remained constant was the household's internal architecture. A father whose public persona was relaxed but whose domestic manner was rigid, controlled, and punitive, and a mother whose warmth was real but whose availability was eroded by addiction. That was the air the children breathed. The children arrived in rapid succession, and they deserved to be understood as separate people. Gary Evan Crosby, the eldest, was born on June 27, 1933, in Los Angeles. He was the son who seemed to need both rebellion and recognition in almost equal measure. Talented enough to record hit duets with his father, restless enough to chafe under the household's rules, and ultimately defiant enough to become the one who tore the family myth apart in print. Gary had his father's performing instinct and none of his father's gift for concealment. What he wanted, in the way that eldest sons of difficult fathers often want, was acknowledgement. And what he received, by his own later account, was discipline administered with a metal-studded belt and affection withheld as a matter of principle. Dennis Michael Crosby and Phillip Leng Crosby, the twins, were born on July 13th, 1934. They were close in age to Gary, but different in temperament and in the way the family's pressures would eventually express themselves. Dennis would later be described, even by family members who defended Bing, as one of the more damaged sons, the one who seemed to absorb the household's chaos most visibly, who carried the wound closest to the surface. Philip became the brother who most forcefully defended their father's memory in adulthood, insisting the discipline had been proportional, the punishments deserved, the household normal. He said this while wrestling, by his own acknowledgement, with alcoholism that would follow him for decades. The family's dysfunction did not produce a single response. It produced 4 different versions of survival, and none of them worked. Lindsay Harry Crosby, the youngest of the first 4, was born on January 5th, 1938. Friends remembered him as the most easygoing of the brothers, laid back, witty, pleasant company. He did not have Gary's combative energy or the twins' twinned intensity. He was the baby of the family, born into the household's rhythms rather than shaped by its earliest chaos. And in many ways, his story is the most quietly devastating of the 4, because it looks less like a dramatic unraveling than a long, slow failure to ever fully arrive at adulthood. Lindsay's life, from his teenage years onward, reads like a man drifting through the wake of a ship he never quite boarded. The domestic reality of the first Crosby household, as Gary later described it in his 1983 memoir and as other family members partly corroborated, was governed by a system of control that the public never saw. Gary alleged that Bing's punishments were ritualized and severe, carried out with a belt studded with metal, and that the emotional atmosphere bore no resemblance to the relaxed, affable father the cameras recorded. The beatings in Gary's telling were not spontaneous outbursts triggered by a particular misbehavior. They were ceremonies. The father decided the infraction warranted punishment, the boys were summoned, and the punishment was administered with deliberation and without warmth. What lingered, Gary said, was not only the pain but the coldness, the sense that this was not anger but policy. The boys grew up in a household where affection was conditional, approval was scarce, and the path to their father's attention ran through performance. They attended to Catholic schools. They were expected to maintain discipline, defer to authority, and uphold the Crosby name in a way that reflected well on the family's public image. The gap between what the outside world saw, four fortunate sons of America's most beloved entertainer, and what those sons experienced inside the house was, by Gary's account, a daily source of confusion and pain. They lived in a mansion. They were fed, clothed, and educated. They had access to the most exclusive circles in Hollywood. And they were, by the account of the son who eventually told the story publicly, afraid of their own father. Philip's public rebuttal is important here, not because it cancels Gary's account, but because it reveals what this family did with pain. Philip insisted they had not received an extra whack they did not deserve. That sentence is worth sitting with because it is not a denial of the beatings. It is the language of a man who internalized the system so completely that he could still, decades later, describe it as fair. Dennis, for his part, said Gary had been treated the most severely. The family never agreed on a single version of what happened inside those walls. What is not in dispute is what happened to the four sons afterward. All of them struggled with alcohol, all of them struggled professionally, and two of them ended their own lives. One detail from Gary's account captures the household better than any generalization could. He described an incident in which Philip, as a young boy, hid his breakfast, bacon and eggs, under a rug rather than finish eating it. When the hidden food was eventually discovered, Philip was forced to eat it from the floor, dirt and all, while the rest of the family watched. That single moment does more narrative work than paragraphs of summarized strictness. It tells you this was a house where discipline could slide into ritual humiliation, where the point was not the child's nourishment or education, but the father's unchallenged authority, and where a small act of childhood resistance, the kind of thing most parents would handle with a sigh and a conversation, could be met with a punishment designed not to correct but to shame. Bing's own psychology resists simplification, and that resistance is part of the story's power. He was not, by most accounts, a one-dimensional tyrant. He was a man who could be casual, funny, and generous in the wider world, warm with colleagues, relaxed on set, improvisational in performance, capable of enormous charm, yet emotionally inaccessible and sharply punitive at home, particularly with the four boys of his first marriage. Gary later said the public Bing and the private Bing were both real. That is a more disturbing assessment than a simple unmasking, because it means the warmth was genuine. It simply was not available to his sons. Even Bing himself, years before his death, acknowledged that he may have failed them. He said it publicly, in interviews, with the same calm and measured delivery he brought to everything. He cited too much discipline, too much money given without guidance, and too little time and personal attention. He framed it as regret, but regret offered publicly while the damaged sons were alive and listening and still struggling with the consequences of that very parenting is a complicated thing. It is not repair. It is confession without consequence. It is the sound of a man acknowledging a wound while making no move to bandage it. Dixie's role was not passive, and the script cannot treat her as merely the suffering wife in the background. She was a mother battling addiction inside a high-pressure celebrity marriage, and in Gary's telling, she was capable of real love and protectiveness. She could be warm, she could be fierce on her children's behalf, and she could also be unreachable, medicated, drunk, or simply absent in the ways that chronic alcoholism makes people absent even when they are physically in the room. The household swung between two poles, Bing's rigidity and Dixie's instability. That combination gave the boys rules, but not safety, structure, but not steadiness. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw. And we're just getting started. Through the 1930s and 40s, the public saw none of this. What the public saw was the photograph. The Crosby family at the Toluca Lake Estate, a sprawling 20-room house in the San Fernando Valley that sat on several acres of manicured grounds, with Bing on the radio, Bing on the movie screen, Bing singing to the nation at Christmas, and the boys occasionally folded into the performance like figures in a family portrait that had to be refreshed for each new season. The house itself was a statement, a compound large enough to signal wealth, traditional enough to signal values, visible enough to feed the public's appetite for proximity to a beloved star. After the family moved to the even grander Holmby Hills residence, the scale increased, but the function remained the same. This was a household designed, at least in its outward presentation, to demonstrate that Bing Crosby's private life matched the warmth and ease of his public one. The family image became a commodity in the most literal sense. The sons appeared in connection with Bing's radio programs and later television specials. The Crosby family was photographed for fan magazines, and those photographs told a story indistinguishable from the one Bing's music told. An American father, surrounded by his handsome sons, living in comfortable prosperity. Mary Crosby, from the second family, later observed that audiences loved seeing what they believed was the real household of a star on television. The Crosby publicity machine understood that instinct and fed it relentlessly. Nobody in the audience, nobody buying the records, nobody tuning into the broadcast had reason to suspect that the home behind the image ran on fear. The best years of the family, or at least the years the public would later sentimentalize, were the years when the photograph still held. Mother alive, father ascendant, boys young enough to be dressed for the camera and positioned around the living room. That era had a sheen to it that was almost impossible to see through from the outside. Bing was at the peak of his cultural power. His films grossed enormous sums. His radio ratings were the highest in the country. He was recording at a pace that would eventually produce one of the largest discographies in American popular music. And the family, bundled into that success, became part of the package in a way that would later make the private revelations feel not just sad but obscene. As though the public had been sold a domestic product that was defective from the inside. In 1943, a Christmas tree fire badly damaged the Toluca Lake house, the holiday home of the man whose voice had become synonymous with Christmas in America, scarred by flame in the middle of the season. The boys were tied to the accident in family lore, and whether or not one reads the detail as metaphor, the image is hard to set aside. The most famous hearth in American entertainment charred and smoking, while Bing's voice continued to drift through millions of radios undisturbed. The house was repaired, the family carried on, the image was maintained. By the late 40s and early 50s, the public and private versions of the Crosby family were running on parallel tracks that never intersected. Bing and Gary recorded duets together, a double-sided gold record that made industry history, and the press reported a father-son musical bond that felt warm and marketable simultaneously. Gary was talented. He had his father's ear, his father's timing, and enough natural ability to make the collaboration feel genuine rather than manufactured. The record sold well. The photographs showed a proud father and a gifted son sharing a microphone. That collaboration mattered because it illuminated the seduction built into the Crosby family system. Approval came through performance. The father's spotlight could feel like love. Standing beside Bing in the recording studio, singing harmonies that millions of Americans would purchase, Gary could briefly inhabit the version of the relationship the public believed was real. The easy father, the appreciative son, the musical bond that transcended whatever ordinary frictions occurred behind closed doors. That it was not the whole truth, that the same father could be tender in the studio and terrifying at the dinner table, was the central cruelty of growing up inside the Crosby name. The boys learned early that the way into Bing's world was to be useful to Bing's image. Performance was the currency, discipline was the structure, and love, if it existed at all in that household, was something you earned by standing where the cameras could see you and behaving as the situation required. None of the four sons would survive that lesson cleanly. None of them would ever fully separate what they wanted from their father, approval, tenderness, the simple feeling of being known, from what the public wanted from the Crosby name. And then, on November 1st, 1952, the center gave way. Dixie Lee Crosby died of ovarian cancer. She was 42 years old, or 43, depending on which public record one trusts, and her death left the four boys at ages that maximized their vulnerability in different but equally damaging ways. Gary was 19, technically an adult but not yet formed, already moving toward the defiance and the drinking that would define his 20s and beyond. The twins, Dennis and Phillip, were 18, old enough to process the loss consciously, young enough to be shattered by it in ways they could not articulate and would not resolve for decades. And Lindsay was 14, a ninth grader. The youngest child, still deep in adolescence, motherless now in a household defined by celebrity, Catholic severity, and a father who, by every account that has survived from inside those walls, did not know how to be gentle with his own sons. Dixie had been ill for some time, and the boys had watched the deterioration, had watched a woman already diminished by years of drinking become further diminished by disease. Her final months were a private agony, conducted inside a family that had long practice in keeping its suffering invisible to the public. Bing continued to work. The machine continued to produce content, records, broadcasts, the warm and effortless public image that was by now as much an industry as any recording studio. Dixie died inside that machine, and her sons mourned her inside it too. On November 3rd, 1952, the family gathered at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills for the Requiem High Mass. Cameras waited outside on Santa Monica Boulevard. 4 boys sat inside. The congregation included friends, colleagues, and the kind of Hollywood figures whose attendance at a funeral was itself a form of industry ritual. But the boys inside that church were not industry figures. They were children, or what remained of childhood in that family, sitting in the front of a Catholic ceremony for a mother whose struggles they had lived through and whose absence they would now have to absorb, without any clear understanding of how families put themselves back together after something like this. However troubled the marriage had been, however deep Dixie's alcoholism had gone, she had been the only person who occupied the space between those sons and a father they already experienced as remote, exacting, or frightening. Her death did not simply remove a mother. It removed the last structural possibility that the first Crosby household might learn to become something softer. Whatever chance there had been, and it may never have been a large chance, was now gone. The period immediately after Dixie's death should have been a turning point. A different father might have drawn closer to his sons, might have recognized their vulnerability and softened accordingly. By all accounts, that is not what happened. Bing continued working. The household continued to operate on its existing terms, and each son responded to the loss in a way that forecasted decades to come. Gary, now legally free of the house, moved further into defiance and eventually into his own drinking. The eldest son, untethered, carrying his father's name and his father's damage into a world that expected him to be charming and found him increasingly difficult. Dennis and Phillip, just entering manhood, lost the household's emotional center at precisely the moment their adult identities were struggling to form. Both would carry alcoholism through the decades that followed, like an inheritance more reliable than any trust fund. And Lindsay, the most exposed, became the child no one quite knew how to help. The youngest, the quietest, the one most easily overlooked in a family that was already coming apart at its seams. Within 5 years, Bing Crosby would remarry. He would choose a woman 30 years his junior, a young Texan actress named Katharine Grant, who was everything Dixie had not been in the final years, and sober, organized, structurally capable, and determined to build a household that functioned. He would have 3 more children. He would raise them in Northern California, away from Hollywood, in what the second family would later describe as a warm, attentive, and present domestic life. And for the 4 sons of the first marriage, that second family would become something worse than abandonment. It would become evidence, living, breathing, photographed evidence, that their father had always been capable of tenderness, of attention, of the kind of fatherhood they had needed and never received. He had not been incapable. He had simply chosen or failed to be different with them. That realization, when it came, would not arrive all at once. It would build slowly, across decades of watching from the outside as Bing Crosby became, by all appearances, the father they had always wanted him to be, just not for them. Bing Crosby married Catherine Grant in Las Vegas on October 24th, 1957. The courtship had lasted roughly 4 years, and everything about the new union seemed designed, whether consciously or not, to answer the failures of the first. Catherine was 23 years old. Bing was 54. She was young, ambitious, Texan, and far more structurally capable than Dixie had been in the final years of her life. She was sober, she was organized. She had the temperament of someone who intended to manage a household, not merely inhabit one. In the architecture of this story, Catherine is not a villain. She is the hinge between two versions of Bing Crosby's domestic life, and her importance lies in what her presence proved. That the man who had been cold, rigid, and emotionally absent with his first four sons was capable, under different circumstances and with a different partner, of being something else entirely. The children of the second marriage arrived quickly. Harry Lillis Crosby III in 1958, Mary Frances Crosby in 1959, Nathaniel Crosby in 1961. The chronology matters because it creates a generational chasm between the two sets of siblings that cannot be bridged by shared blood alone. By the time Harry was learning to walk, Gary was 25 and already deep into the drinking and professional instability that would define his adult life. By the time Mary was a schoolgirl, the twins were approaching 30 and struggling to build careers that could stand independently of their father's name. By the time Nathaniel was old enough to form memories, Lindsay was already a man in his mid-20s, already drifting, already on the trajectory that would end in a Calabasas apartment. The two families were not simply different in composition, they were different in kind, separated by decades, by circumstance, by geography, and by the version of Bing Crosby each set of children received. The move to Hillsborough in the San Francisco Peninsula in the early 1960s is one of the most useful narrative pivots in the entire story. Bing and Catherine left Hollywood for a 10-bedroom Tudor estate and eventually a larger French chateau-style house in the same affluent community, saying in effect that the children should be raised outside the industry glare that had defined the first household. The decision was deliberate. Hollywood had been the setting for everything that went wrong, and the drinking, the isolation, the punishing routines, the proximity to an industry that treated families as public property. Hillsborough was quiet, wealthy, and anonymous in the way the old peninsula money preferred. The children attended schools with non-show business families. They had room to move outdoors, to play sports, to grow up in something resembling normalcy. Harry and Mary both described, in later interviews, a distinctly different kind of childhood from the one Gary had documented. Harry recalled breakfasts with his father, conversations that felt unhurried, a man who was older now and seemed to understand that presence mattered more than discipline. Mary described a household with structure, but also warmth, a mother who ran things efficiently and a father who, while still formal in his way, was capable of playfulness that would have been unrecognizable to his first four sons. She remembered Bing singing White Christmas for the children in June just because they asked, turning the nation's most famous holiday song into a private joke. Harry later called the Hillsborough move a reset button. That phrase is worth noting because of what it implies. The first attempt at family life had been a failure serious enough to require starting over entirely, in a different city, with a different woman, under different rules. That is the cruel counterpoint at the center of this documentary. The second family remembers meals together, laughter, a father who was present and engaged. The first family remembers belts, fear, emotional distance, and a mother drinking herself to death. Both sets of memories appear to be true. Both describe the same man. And the fact that both can coexist is not a contradiction so much as an indictment, not of hypocrisy in the simple sense, but of a man who grew, or changed, or simply had the good fortune to marry the right woman the second time, while the four sons of the first marriage were left to carry the cost of the earlier version. Meanwhile, the first four sons attempted adulthood under their famous surname and failed in ways that were increasingly public and increasingly painful. In the late 1950s, they formed the Crosby Boys, a nightclub act that carried Bing's name onto Las Vegas stages and television variety shows. The act was, on its surface, a natural extension of the family brand. Four handsome sons performing together, trading on the warmth of the Crosby name doing what Crosby sons were supposed to do. They could sing. They were good looking. They had the name. On paper, it should have worked. It did not. Underneath the act was a scene of ongoing fracture. The brothers drank. They fought. They arrived in varying states of readiness. Mary later recalled the story that Gary, drunk and too difficult to manage, was thrown out of the act before a scheduled performance, and Bing himself stepped in as the fourth Crosby boy that very afternoon. The father, well into his 50s, decades past the point where he needed a Las Vegas nightclub to validate his career, slid into the act and performed the set as though he had always been there. The anecdote is funny on the surface and devastating underneath. It captures everything about the family dynamic in a single evening. The son still orbiting the father's name professionally, still unable to function without it, and the father still capable of stepping in and doing the job better than any of them could manage. Their own act did not belong to them. Even their attempt at independence was in the end his. The Crosby boys' act eventually dissolved, as it was always going to. The brothers could not hold themselves together long enough to sustain a professional partnership, and the act became one more failed attempt to convert the Crosby name into something that actually worked for the people who bore it. What it left behind was a trail of canceled bookings, drunken incidents, and the growing public sense that Bing Crosby's first four sons were not doing well. That the family behind the most beloved voice in American entertainment was producing young men who could not seem to function. In 1959, with the Crosby boys' era collapsing and the second family still in its early years, Bing gave a public interview in which he reflected on his first sons with unusual candor. He admitted he may not have done well by them. He cited too much discipline, too much money given without purpose or guidance, and too little time and personal attention. He spoke about it the way he spoke about everything, calmly, with a kind of measured reasonableness that made even self-criticism sound like an observation about someone else's life. And then he said something that landed differently from the way he may have intended. He framed his new infant son, Harry, as another chance to do better. He said he hoped to avoid the mistakes he had made the first time. He said it publicly. That line should not be read as redemption. It is an admission made while the first four sons, Gary 26, the twins 25, Lindsay 21, were old enough to hear it, old enough to read it in a newspaper or hear it replayed on a television program, old enough to understand exactly what it meant. Their father was not simply acknowledging failure in the abstract. He was announcing on the record that he was trying again with a new set of children, that the first attempt had not worked, and that the next one might go differently. The younger family was not just a new chapter in Bing's life. It was, for the four older sons, an unintentional verdict on their own childhoods, a public statement that what they had experienced was, by their father's own assessment, a failure worth correcting. The correction just would not be applied to them. The decades that followed should feel, in the telling, like a slow tightening of the space available to the first four sons. They cycled through music gigs, small acting jobs, marriages that ended badly, drinking that worsened, and public embarrassments that the press covered with the particular relish reserved for the children of famous men who cannot live up to the name. Mary Crosby, looking back from the vantage of the second family, described it with blunt precision. Decades of fires and car wrecks and shotgun marriages. That is not literary language. It is the language of a woman who grew up watching, from a comfortable distance, as her older half-brothers moved through catastrophe after catastrophe with the Crosby name around their necks, like a collar they could neither wear proudly nor remove. Each son's trajectory was different, but the direction was the same. Dennis struggled with alcoholism that deepened through the 1960s and 70s, his life increasingly defined by the disease that had already claimed his mother. Phillip fought his own drinking while maintaining the public posture that the family had been normal. The disciplined fair, the father misunderstood, a defense that required an exhausting amount of energy to sustain, because it meant denying every day the reality of his own childhood. Lindsay drifted. That is the simplest and most painful way to say it. He moved through small-time entertainment work, through relationships that did not hold, through a life that never seemed to locate its own center of gravity. He had his father's name and none of his father's drive, and the result was an adulthood that looked from the outside like a man waiting for something to happen to him rather than making anything happen himself. And Gary, The eldest, the one who carried the most anger and the most talent, watched his career narrow from recording sessions and television appearances into a smaller and smaller orbit of grievance, recovery talk, and the particular loneliness of a man who has told an uncomfortable truth and been punished for it by half his own family. None of them found a stable, adult version of the life their father's name and fortune should have made possible. The money was there, at least for a time. The name opened doors, at least initially. What was missing, what had never been provided, was the internal architecture that a different childhood might have built: confidence, self worth, the ability to construct a life that did not depend on someone else's approval or someone else's money. The first four Crosby sons had been raised in a system that taught them performance was love and discipline was attention. And when they stepped into the adult world, they discovered that the system had not prepared them for anything except needing their father. Bing Crosby died on October 14th, 1977, on a golf course outside Madrid. He was 74 years old, still touring, still performing, still in motion. He had played a round of golf at the La Moraleja course, finished the 18th hole, walked toward the clubhouse, and collapsed from a massive heart attack. The death was sudden, and in the way the public received it, almost poetic. A beloved figure dying while doing something he loved, far from hospitals and complications, with the ease that had always been his signature. The world mourned the entertainer. The tributes poured in from presidents and fellow performers. The funeral drew enormous crowds. But the four sons of the first marriage experienced the death differently. For them, Bing's death did not arrive as the gentle passing of a beloved father. It arrived as a door slamming shut on any possibility of reckoning. Gary was 44. He had spent 2 decades struggling with his father's legacy, trying to build a career that was not merely an extension of Bing's fame, and failing. The twins were 43, both deep in their own battles with alcohol, both carrying the damage of the first household in different ways. Dennis openly, Phillip behind a wall of denial. Lindsay was 39, already drifting, already dependent on trust income, already living a life that had no clear direction beyond the next disbursement. For all four of them, their father's death meant the same thing. There would be no late life conversation. There would be no acknowledgement, privately and personally, of what the first household had been. There would be no apology that was not also public performance. The man who had shaped their lives through coldness and discipline and withholding was gone. And whatever unfinished business they carried, they carried enormous amounts of it, that would have to be resolved without him. What remained was the estate. And the estate, in the way that large celebrity estates often do, became the arena where the family's unresolved emotional conflicts would be fought in financial terms. Bing's wealth flowed into trusts and corporate structures. Catherine became the custodian of the legacy. And the first four sons found themselves in a position that was both legally defined and emotionally devastating. They were heirs to a fortune they could not fully control, beneficiaries of a name they could not escape, and survivors of a household whose reality was about to become the subject of the most public family argument in American entertainment history. That fight erupted in 1983, and it split the family in a way that would never fully heal. Gary published Going My Own Way, a memoir co-written with Ross Firestone that tore open the Crosby myth with a violence that stunned the public. The book described the beatings, with the metal-studded belt in sickening specificity. It described the emotional coldness, the household run on fear and Catholic rigidity, the father who could perform warmth for an audience of millions, and then walk into his own house and become someone unrecognizable. Gary named Bing Crosby, not as America's beloved father figure, but as a man whose domestic life was the inverse of his public image. The coverage was enormous. Newspapers ran excerpts. Television programs debated whether the book was truth or betrayal or both. The family's response was immediate and fractured. Lindsay publicly welcomed the book's appearance, saying he hoped it would clear up old lies and rumors, a phrase that suggested he had been carrying the family's secrets for decades and was relieved to have them spoken aloud. Dennis, while less vocal in the press, later confirmed that Gary had received the worst of it, that the eldest son's account was not exaggeration. Phillip, however, lashed back with fury. He called Gary a crybaby. He insisted the punishments had been normal and earned. He rejected the premise that anything about their childhood required public confession or apology. And Catherine, protecting the memory and the legacy of the man she had loved and married, published her own book, My Life with Bing. The same year, a counter memoir that presented a Bing who was devoted, gentle, and misunderstood, at least within the household she had known. The result was a public war conducted through publishing houses and press appearances, with the national media serving as the audience and the Crosby name as the territory in dispute. The family did not simply disagree about their father. They disagreed fundamentally and irreconcilably about what had happened to them, about what they had survived, and about whether survival required speaking the truth aloud or maintaining the silence that had always protected the family's public image. That disagreement was never resolved. It simply hardened into permanent opposing camps, and the distance between them grew wider with every passing year. The money thread, running beneath all of it, added its own pressure. Dixie's will had placed her share of the community property, acquired during her marriage to Bing, when his career was generating enormous income, into a trust for her 4 sons. That trust was intended to provide them with income through adulthood, a financial cushion that would allow them to live, if not lavishly, then at least securely. Bing's own estate, after his death in 1977, flowed largely into a marital trust benefiting Catherine, with HLC Properties Limited formed to manage his name, likeness, and commercial interests. The financial architecture told its own story. The second wife controlled the legacy apparatus, and the first wife's children depended on a separate trust that was shrinking. By the late 1980s, that trust had effectively collapsed. The inheritance income that Lindsay and his brothers had relied upon, the money that had allowed them to live as Crosby sons even when they could not function as independent adults, was gone. And for Lindsay, who had built less of an independent life than any of the 4, that collapse was existential. On Monday, December 11th, 1989, Lindsay Crosby was found dead in an apartment in the Las Virgenes area of Calabasas. The coroner's office pronounced him dead at 5:40 p.m. The cause was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 51 years old. The details of the scene are spare, and they should be told that way because their power is in their ordinariness. This was not a grand estate or a penthouse suite. It was not the kind of place where a Crosby son was supposed to end up. It was a quiet apartment, a rented space in the suburban hills northwest of Los Angeles, where a middle-aged man had been staying while receiving treatment for alcoholism at a nearby facility. The apartment was small. A rifle was found near the body. The December light was fading toward evening. The room was the kind of room that tells you everything you need to know about the distance between where a person started and where they arrived. Later accounts say Lindsay had expected to return to his family once treatment was complete. He had a wife. He had plans, or at least the outline of plans. He believed there was a future. What collapsed that belief, according to family representatives and the press coverage that followed, was the discovery that the inheritance income he had relied upon, the money from his mother's trust, the financial cushion that had allowed him to function as an adult without ever fully building an independent life, was gone. The mechanism that had kept him afloat, the last material connection to the Crosby name that actually translated into security, had been pulled away. The image is stark and deserves to sit without embellishment. The son of one of the richest and most beloved entertainers in American history, dead in a quiet rented room after learning that the money beneath him had vanished. Not a dramatic confrontation with a family member, not a public breakdown captured by cameras, just the stripped-down humiliations of a middle-aged man in a December apartment, treatment for addiction, financial dependency exposed, a famous surname that opened no doors that mattered, arriving all at once in the fading light of a Monday afternoon in the hills above Los Angeles. There is something about that detail worth sitting with for a moment. Lindsay Crosby grew up inside one of the most celebrated names in American culture. His father's voice was the sound of Christmas itself, the literal recorded soundtrack of the American holiday. His father's image was warmth, ease, the uncomplicated good life. And Lindsay's own life had narrowed, by the age of 51, to a rented apartment in the hills, a treatment facility he was attending for the alcoholism that had shadowed him for decades, and a trust fund that had evaporated beneath him. The public still associated the Crosby name with comfort and generosity and familial warmth. The private reality, by December of 1989, was a man who had never fully constructed an adult life outside his father's shadow and his mother's trust, who had never learned, because he had never been taught, how to stand on ground that was his own. When the last financial support was removed, when the inheritance that had been his one reliable connection to the Crosby fortune disappeared, Lindsay could not find a reason to continue. He was the youngest son. He was the one friends remembered as the most pleasant, the most easygoing, the easiest to like. He was also, in the end, the first to die. The family's public response was handled with the kind of restraint that famous families learn to deploy when private catastrophe threatens to become public spectacle. There was a spokeswoman. There was the coroner's official ruling of suicide. There were the headlines which tied the death to the loss of inheritance income and reminded readers one more time that Bing Crosby's household had not been what it appeared. The press coverage was careful but pointed. This was the son of the man who sang White Christmas, the man whose voice meant comfort and warmth and family, and his son had ended his life in a rented apartment after the money ran out. Gary's memoir, published 6 years earlier, had been dismissed by some as bitterness and exaggeration. The complaints of a difficult eldest son who could not accept responsibility for his own failures. Lindsay's death made it harder to dismiss. The book that had been treated as a family scandal now looked with terrible clarity like a prophecy. Gary had written about what the first household did to them. Lindsay's death was what it looked like when the damage finished its work. The public, processing the news in December of 1989, could still tell itself a story about one troubled man, one individual collapse. That story would not hold for long. But Lindsay was not the end of the story. He was only the first. 17 months later, the family would reach a place even darker than a December apartment in Calabasas, and what had already felt like a tragedy. One man's collapse, one family's failure, was about to become something that could no longer be explained away as individual weakness. 17 months after Lindsay's death, the phone rang again. On May 4th, 1991, Dennis Crosby was found dead in his home in Novato, a small city in Marin County north of San Francisco. A roommate discovered the body. The cause was an apparently self-inflicted shotgun wound. He was 56 years old. The coroner ruled it a suicide. The second son of Bing Crosby's first marriage had ended his life in a manner so parallel to his younger brother's that the repetition itself became the story. Lindsay had used a rifle in a Calabasas apartment. Dennis used a shotgun in a Novato house. Lindsay had been 51. Dennis was 56. Both were living in modest circumstances that would have been unimaginable to anyone who only knew the Crosby name from the records and the films and the Christmas specials. Both had spent their adult lives struggling with alcoholism. Both had failed, in their different ways, to build lives that could sustain them once the financial and emotional scaffolding of the Crosby family was removed. The details were different, the shape was identical. And the shape was what mattered, because it turned what could still be narrated as one man's isolated tragedy into something systemic, a pattern, a transmission, a consequence that could no longer be explained by pointing at Lindsay's personal circumstances or Lindsay's particular fragility. Dennis had been, in many ways, the most quietly tragic of the four brothers. He did not have Gary's combative public persona or his willingness to turn private pain into published accusation. He did not have Lindsay's reputation for easy charm or the particular pathos of the youngest child's slow drift. He was the twin who absorbed the household's damage most visibly, the one who seemed, even to family members inclined to defend Bing, to have been genuinely broken by what he had experienced as the child. His alcoholism was severe and persistent, the kind that narrows a life year by year until there's almost nothing left. His professional career had never gained real traction outside the brief, unhappy life of the Crosby Boys Act. He had married and divorced. He had moved through the decades in a way that left few public traces, which is itself a kind of statement about how thoroughly the damage had done its work. He had lived in Northern California, not far from the Hillsborough estate, where his father's second family had built the different, warmer life that the first four sons were never offered. Whether that geographic proximity was coincidence or something more painful, a gravitational pull toward the evidence of what he had been denied, a need to live near the house where his father had finally become the parent he should have been all along, is a question that cannot be answered now. What can be said is that Dennis Crosby spent his final years in the same region where his father had tried to start over, and that the proximity did not save him. Nothing did. Mary Crosby, from the second family, later said the bluntest and most devastating thing anyone in the family has said publicly about the first four sons. She said 2 out of 4 commit suicide. Something is very wrong with the picture. That sentence should be allowed to stand without commentary because it does not need any. It is a verdict delivered from inside the family, from a woman who grew up in the other household with a different mother and a different version of the same father, and who could see with the clarity that distance provides that whatever had happened in the first Crosby home had left damage deep enough to kill. The two suicides taken together changed the public conversation about the Crosby family permanently. Before Lindsay's death, the family dispute had been primarily literary, a battle of books, Gary's memoir against Catherine's counter-memoir, the difficult eldest son against the loyal second wife, with the public free to choose which version they preferred. Many chose Catherine's. It was easier. It preserved the image of Bing that the country wanted to keep, the warm voice, the easy smile, the father who sang his children to sleep. After Dennis's death, the dispute became something else entirely. It became evidence. 2 sons dead by their own hands, 2 out of 4. The numbers carried a weight that no amount of counter-memoir could lift. They pointed with the cold clarity of arithmetic at the household itself, at the system that had produced these men, at the childhood that had shaped them, at the distance between the father the public adored and the father those 4 boys had actually known. Individual failure could explain one suicide. It could not explain 2. What could explain 2 was a family environment so damaging, so fundamentally corrosive to the development of the children inside it, that a 50% fatality rate among the sons was not a coincidence, but a consequence. The press coverage after Dennis's death was more subdued than it had been after Lindsay's. There were fewer headlines, less shock, less of the breathless surprise that had characterized the earlier coverage. The public had already begun to absorb the uncomfortable idea that the Crosby family story was darker than they had wanted to believe, darker than the records and the Christmas specials and the easy warmth of Bing's public image had ever suggested. Dennis's death confirmed what Lindsay's had suggested and what Gary's book had alleged years before. The first Crosby household had produced 4 damaged men, and the damage was lethal. The question was no longer whether something had gone wrong inside that family. The question was whether anything could have gone differently, whether the same man who built a warm second family in Hillsborough could have, with different choices or a different wife, or simply more awareness of what he was doing to his sons, given the first 4 boys a chance at survival. Gary Crosby, the eldest, the one who had torn the myth open in print, did not die by suicide. He died of lung cancer in Burbank on August 24, 1995. He was 62 years old. His death was, in its way, the quietest of the 4. A medical cause, a hospital bed, an ending that did not require a coroner's ruling or a police investigation. But Gary's place in the story is tragic in a different register from his brother's, because he was the one who chose to speak and then had to live with the consequences of speaking. He wrote the book, he sat for the interviews, he described the belt, the coldness, the household run on fear, and he put his name on all of it. He endured Phillip's public fury, Catherine's counteroffensive, the divided response of a public that could not decide whether he was a brave truth-teller or a bitter, ungrateful son trying to profit from his father's name one last time. He lived long enough to see Lindsay's death validate what he had written, to see the argument shift from was Gary exaggerating to was Gary warning us? And he lived long enough to see Dennis's death make that validation almost unbearable. By the time Gary was dying of cancer in a Burbank hospital, 2 of his 3 brothers had killed themselves. The family was permanently fractured, and the book that was supposed to have freed him had instead defined him. He was the son who told the truth. The truth did not save his brothers. It did not heal the family. And it did not, in the end, give Gary himself the peace or the closure or the recognition he seems to have been seeking since he was a boy, standing in a recording studio next to a father who could be warm for the microphone and cold for the child. Philip Lang Crosby, the last surviving son of the first marriage, died on January 13th, 2004. He was 69. Of the four brothers, Philip had been the most committed and most public defender of the family image, the one who insisted, repeatedly and forcefully, that the punishments had been earned. The household had been normal. The father had been a good man operating by the standards of his era and his faith. He maintained that position through Gary's book, through Lindsay's suicide, through Dennis's suicide, through Gary's death from cancer. He did not waver, at least not in public. He did not recant. He did not offer a revised version of the story that might have accommodated both his own memories and the evidence that the household had destroyed his brothers. Whether Philip genuinely believed what he said, whether his defense of Bing was a sincere assessment of his own childhood, or a survival mechanism so deeply embedded that he could not distinguish it from conviction, is a question that died with him and can never be answered. Some people survive difficult childhoods by naming what happened to them. Others survive by insisting it did not happen, or that it was normal, or that it was deserved. Philip chose the second path. It kept him alive longer than two of his brothers. Whether it gave him peace is something only he knew. What is certain is that Philip's own life was not untouched by the household's legacy. He struggled with alcoholism, the same disease that had consumed his mother and all three of his brothers. He acknowledged that corporal punishment had occurred, while insisting it had been proportional and justified. He lived inside a version of the family story that required him to be the brother who said everything was fine, the one who held the line against Gary's accusations. Even as the evidence, two dead brothers, a family permanently at war, a name that had become synonymous with private dysfunction, accumulated around him year after year. When Philip died, all four of Bing and Dixie Lee Crosby's sons were gone. The entire first household had consumed itself in less than 7 decades. 4 boys, born between 1933 and 1938, raised in what was then the wealthiest entertainment household in America, and not one of them lived to see 70. The legal battles continued even after the sons began to die, because in families built on celebrity wealth, grief does not suspend litigation, it fuels it. In 1996, the trust established under Wilma Crosby's name, Dixie's legal identity, sued HLC Properties Limited and Catherine Crosby over income derived from the community property of Bing and Dixie's marriage. The argument was straightforward in legal terms and devastating in human ones. The first wife's estate claimed a continuing interest in the revenue generated by Bing's name, likeness, and commercial legacy, revenue that was being managed and controlled by entities created after Bing's death, entities aligned with the second family. The first wife's sons had lived and died on income from a trust that was shrinking. The second wife controlled an apparatus that was generating ongoing revenue from the same man's fame. The imbalance was not merely financial, it was existential. It said, in the language of property law, what the family dynamics had always said. The first household was expendable, and the second household controlled the legacy. The parties settled in 1999 for approximately $1.5 million. But the litigation did not end there. Further proceedings continued into the 2000s, reaching California appellate courts over the question of whether Dixie's estate held a community property interest in Bing's right of publicity, the legal right to profit from his image, voice, and name after death. The case turned on technical questions about release language in the 1999 settlement and whether that settlement had extinguished all future claims. The legal doctrine is dry. The human reality behind it is not. Decades after Bing's death, decades after Dixie's death, decades after 2 of their sons had killed themselves, the family was still fighting in court over who owned the commercial value of a dead man's smile. The cultural afterlife of the Crosby family story settled over the decades into a fractured but permanent shape. No major scripted film or television series has ever directly dramatized the destruction of Bing Crosby's first family. A notable absence, given how many other celebrity family tragedies have been adapted for the screen. The story lives instead in the books and the documentary record. The 1983 book War, Gary's Going My Own Way, co-written with Ross Firestone against Catherine's My Life with Bing, fixed the dispute in published form, where it has remained for more than 4 decades. Gary's book is still in print. Catherine's is still cited. Neither has been superseded. Neither has been refuted. They sit side by side in the cultural record, two versions of the same family that cannot be reconciled because they describe the same man at different points in his life and the same household at different stages of its disintegration. In 2014, PBS aired Bing Crosby, rediscovered as part of its American Master series, and the documentary brought the family conflict into a more reflective and nuanced frame than the book War had allowed. Mary, Harry, and Nathaniel Crosby all participated, describing a father who had been present, involved, and warm, a man who read to his children, who took them fishing, who made an effort in the second household to be the kind of father he had failed to be in the first. Biographer Gary Giddens contributed a portrait that was deeply admiring of Bing's artistry, while acknowledging the complexity and the darkness of the family history. The documentary did not attempt to settle the argument between the two households. It could not. What it accomplished was something subtler. It demonstrated that the Crosby legacy had moved beyond simple accusation and simple defense into a state of permanent, unresolvable tension. The first family's suffering and the second family's warmth were both real, both were documented, and both would continue to exist in the public record side by side as long as anyone cared to look. The 1947 film Smash Up, The Story of a Woman, starring Susan Hayward, has been cited over the years as a loose reflection of Dixie Lee's life, a story about a talented singer whose career is eclipsed by her husband's fame and who descends into alcoholism. The film was never officially acknowledged as being based on Dixie, but the parallels were noted at the time and have been noted since. It is a minor cultural footnote, but it is worth including because it shows that the private reality of the first Crosby marriage was visible to people inside the industry even while Bing was alive, even while the public image was still officially intact. What remains of the Crosby family as of the present day is defined by an asymmetry so stark it tells the story by itself, without narration or commentary. The first family is gone entirely. All four sons are dead, two by suicide, one of lung cancer, one at 69 after a lifetime of defending a childhood that killed his brothers. Their mother has been dead since 1952. Their collective legacy is a memoir that tore a family apart, two suicides that confirmed his darkest claims, and a series of lawsuits that translated private grief into the language of legal doctrine. There are no surviving children of the first marriage left to tell their side. Gary's book remains. Everything else is silence. The second family survives, and the contrast is as sharp as anything in the narrative. Harry Crosby is 67 years old. He built a career that deliberately and completely separated itself from the entertainment industry, moving into investment banking and private equity, where the Crosby name carried no particular weight and performance was measured in returns, not applause. His professional biography lists him Atlantic North America in New York. He is, by all public indications, the Crosby child who most successfully escaped the gravitational pull of the family name, who understood, perhaps because he had watched what the name did to his older half-brothers, that survival meant building a life defined entirely by his own work. Mary Crosby is 66. She remains publicly identified with her acting career, most memorably her role on Dallas, where she played the character who shot J.R. Ewing, a moment of television history that briefly made her one of the most recognized faces in America. Over the decades, she has been one of the more candid members of the second family in discussing the disparity between the two Crosby households. Her 2 out of 4 observation remains the sharpest, most concise verdict the family has produced from within, a sentence that manages to be both statistically precise and emotionally devastating. Public records are less clear about her present-day circumstances and that privacy deserves to be respected. Nathaniel Crosby is 64. He is associated publicly with golf, the sport his father loved above almost everything else in his life, the sport Bing was playing on the October afternoon when he collapsed and died on a course outside Madrid. Nathaniel won the United States Amateur Championship in 1981 at the age of 19. Which gave the Crosby name a brief, bright moment in the sport Bing had cherished most. His official materials place him in North Palm Beach, Florida, where the game that connected him most directly to his father's memory continues to define his public identity. Catherine Crosby, who had been the hinge between the two households, the woman whose sobriety, competence, and determination made the second family possible, died in Hillsborough in September of 2024 at the age of 90. She had outlived all four of Bing's first sons by decades. She had defended his memory for more than 40 years through Gary's book, through the suicides, through the lawsuits, through the PBS documentary. She had maintained consistently and to the end that the Bing she knew was a good man and a good father. Whether she was right, whether the man she married was fundamentally different from the man Dixie had married, or whether she simply arrived at a point in his life when he was ready to be better, is one of the questions this story leaves unresolved. The family estate in Hillsborough, the property that had represented the second family's quieter, more stable existence, was sold in 2025 and relisted in 2026 after renovation. Even the house that symbolized the reset belongs to someone else now. The interviews Harry and Mary gave over the years are valuable precisely because they are not simple denials of what Gary wrote. They do not say Gary lied. They do not say the first household was happy. What they say, consistently and with the measured precision of people who have thought about this for a long time, is that they experience a different man. Harry described a father who was older, quieter, and more deliberate, a man who seemed to understand in his 50s and 60s that time mattered and that children needed more than discipline and distance. Mary described a household with warmth and humor, a mother who was competent and present, and a father who could be playful in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the brothers who came before. Their testimony does not erase Gary's. It exists alongside it, in permanent and unresolvable tension, two sets of genuine memories describing the same man at different points in his life. That tension is, in the end, the truest thing about this story. The point is not that one set of children lied and the other told the truth. The point is not that Bing was secretly a monster, or that Gary was secretly a liar, or that Catherine was secretly complicit. The point is that Bing Crosby appears to have been capable of living as two different fathers, in two different households across two different eras of his life, and that the first four sons got the earlier version, the version that was rigid, punitive, emotionally withholding, and ultimately destructive. They paid for it with everything they had. Their mother paid for it with her health. Their childhoods paid for it with their safety. And two of them paid for it with their lives. The second family got something different. Whether that difference came from Catherine's strength, or from Bing's growth, or from the simple passage of time, or from some combination of all three, cannot be determined with certainty. What can be determined is the outcome. The first family produced four sons, and all four are dead, two by suicide, one of cancer at 62, one of causes that closed the chapter at 69. The second family produced three children who built lives of their own, who speak of their father with affection and nuance, and who survive. The disparity is not a mystery. It is a record of what happens when the same name, the same wealth, and the same fame produce two completely different versions of a home. Bing Crosby's story is not, in the end, about hypocrisy in the simple sense. A man who pretended to be one thing and was secretly another. It is about the cost of a public image so successful, so deeply embedded in the national culture, that it could outsing the people living inside it. He gave America ease, warmth, ritual, and one of its most durable sounds. His voice still plays in department stores every December. His name still evokes a particular kind of mid-century comfort that the country has never quite stopped longing for. But what his first sons appear to have inherited was not that ease. It was discipline without tenderness, fame without shelter, and a surname heavy enough to survive every one of them. There is no neat moral to that. There is only the fact that the man who made White Christmas feel like home left behind a first family for whom home was the wound that never healed.